The afternoon sun beat down on the town of Redemption Creek like divine judgment, turning the dusty main street into a ribbon of scorched earth. Martha Henley stood on the porch of her modest homestead at the edge of town, her weathered hands gripping a broom handle, as if it might anchor her to something solid in a world that had become treacherously uncertain. 3 months had passed since they buried her husband Samuel beneath the cottonwood tree on the hill. 3 months since the coughing sickness had taken him in the night, leaving her alone with 2 children and a farm that demanded the strength of 10 men. She swept the same patch of worn wood for the 3rd time, watching the dust devils dance in the yard, trying to ignore the approaching riders whose shadows stretched long across her property like dark omens. They came in pairs, these men, always in pairs, as if their business required witnesses, or perhaps simply courage in numbers. The first was Silas Crow, a rail-thin man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had long ago stopped registering human suffering as anything more than numbers in a ledger. The second was younger, broader, with ham-sized fists and a gun belt that sat low on his hips in the manner of men who wanted you to notice it. They called him Dutch, though Martha suspected that wasn't his Christian name. Their horses moved with the lazy confidence of animals who knew they wouldn't be rushed, wouldn't be challenged, wouldn't be denied. Crow dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose bones had begun to betray him, though his eyes remained sharp as broken glass. He removed his hat in a gesture that might have seemed respectful, if not for the cold calculation behind it, a practiced motion he'd performed at 100 doorsteps before this one. "Mrs. Henley," he said, his voice carrying the dry rasp of a man who'd spent too many years breathing dust and speaking threats. "I trust you've been keeping well, given the circumstances." The words hung in the air like smoke, offering sympathy with one hand while the other remained poised to strike. Dutch stayed mounted, his shadow falling across Martha like a stain, his hand resting casually on his thigh just inches from his revolver. "Mr. Crow," Martha replied, her voice steadier than she felt, the broom handle now a staff she leaned upon. "I wasn't expecting visitors today." It was a lie, and they both knew it. She'd been expecting them since the day Samuel died, knowing that grief kept no creditors at bay, that death settled no debts except those owed to the earth itself. The land loan her husband had taken to expand their holdings, to build the future he'd promised her, had come due with his last breath. Crow smiled, though the expression never reached his eyes, those cold instruments of assessment that measured her worth in dollars and desperation. "Now, Mrs. Henley, you know why we're here," Crow continued, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket with the theatrical precision of a man who enjoyed this part of his work. "The Western Territories Bank has been more than patient, more than generous given your recent loss. But business is business, and accounts must be settled." He unfolded the paper, though Martha knew he didn't need to read it, had probably memorized every word of every debt he collected. $700, Mrs. Henley, principal and interest on the land expansion loan signed by your late husband last spring. The grace period has expired. $700. The number hit her like a physical blow, though she'd known it was coming, had lain awake night after night, trying to calculate how she might conjure such a sum from crops not yet planted, from cattle not yet sold, from a future that seemed to recede with each passing day. It might as well have been 7,000, 7 million. The entire farm wouldn't fetch half that amount in its current state, and selling meant surrendering the only home her children had ever known, the only piece of earth that carried Samuel's sweat and dreams. "I don't have it," Martha said quietly, the admission tasting like ash in her mouth. "The funeral expenses, the medical bills before that, the winter feed for the livestock. I've barely managed to keep us fed. Surely the bank can extend the deadline, accept partial payments. The spring planting will yield enough to begin paying it down." She heard the pleading note creep into her voice and hated herself for it, but pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Crow refolded the document with maddening slowness, each crease a small act of cruelty. The bank has already shown considerable forbearance, Mrs. Henley. I'm afraid their patience has reached its limit." He paused, letting the words settle, watching her face for the precise moment when hope began its final retreat. "However, I'm authorized to offer you one final extension. 3 days, Mrs. Henley. You've got 3 days to pay $700 in full, in cash. After that, the bank will have no choice but to exercise its legal right to foreclose on the property and recover its investment through auction. 3 days. 72 hours to produce a sum that might as well be the moon itself, distant and impossible to grasp." Martha felt her knees weaken, felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Behind her, through the open door, she could hear her daughter Sarah singing softly to her younger brother, some nonsense rhyme about birds and sunshine, the innocent melody of children who didn't yet understand that their world was about to crumble. 3 days, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Crow, please, there must be another way. My children, they've already lost their father. You can't expect me to put them out on the street." The words came faster now, tumbling over each other in their desperation. "I could work, take in laundry, mending, anything. The farm will produce come harvest time, I swear it. Just give me until fall, until the crops come in." Crow replaced his hat, the gesture signaling an end to the conversation as surely as a judge's gavel. 3 days, Mrs. Henley. That's Monday next at noon. You can bring the money to the bank in town, or I'll return here to collect it personally." His eyes drifted to the homestead, to the sturdy barn Samuel had built with his own hands, to the fields that showed the first green promise of spring growth. "Might I suggest you consider your options carefully? $700 is a considerable sum, but not an impossible one for a woman of resourcefulness." The implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Dutch grinned, showing teeth stained by tobacco and malice. Martha's hand tightened on the broom handle until her knuckles went white, rage and humiliation warring in her chest. "Get off my property," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You've delivered your message. Now leave." Crow shrugged, a gesture of supreme indifference. "As you wish. 3 days, Mrs. Henley. The bank will expect full payment." He mounted his horse with the same careful deliberation he'd shown in dismounting, settling into the saddle like a vulture finding its perch. Dutch touched his hat brim in a mockery of respect, his grin widening as they turned their horses toward the road. They had ridden perhaps 50 yards when the stranger emerged from the shadow of the barn, so silent in his approach that neither Crow nor Dutch had noticed his presence until he was simply there, standing in the middle of the path like a man-shaped obstacle carved from the same sun-hardened earth as the land itself. He wore dusty trail clothes that might once have been black, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low enough to shadow most of his face, and a gun belt that showed the worn patina of constant use. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there with the patient stillness of a man who had all the time in the world and knew how to use it. Crow's horse shied slightly, sensing something in the stranger that even the animals found unsettling. "Move aside," Crow ordered, his voice sharp with the irritation of a man whose carefully orchestrated intimidation had been interrupted. "This doesn't concern you, Drifter." The stranger tilted his head slightly, the movement almost curious, like a wolf considering whether prey was worth the effort of pursuit. Still, he said nothing. Dutch's hand moved toward his gun, that casual motion becoming something more deliberate, more threatening. "You deaf, stranger?" The man said, "Move." The stranger's voice, when it finally came, was like stones grinding together, quiet, but carrying an edge that suggested it didn't need volume to command attention. "I heard what you said to the widow." 5 words, delivered without inflection, without judgment, simply a statement of fact. But something in the way he said them made Crow's practiced confidence waver, made Dutch's hand freeze halfway to his weapon. The stranger stood motionless, his face still hidden in shadow, but Martha could see his eyes now, pale as winter ice and just as cold, fixed on the two riders with an intensity that seemed to draw all the heat from the afternoon air. Crow recovered first, falling back on the authority of the bank, the law, the machinery of civilization that supposedly separated men like him from men like the stranger. Then you heard it was bank business, legal and proper. The widow owes a debt, and debts must be paid. That's how civilized society functions, friend. Now, I'll ask you once more, politely, to step aside and let us pass." He emphasized the word civilized, as if it were a talisman against whatever wildness he sensed in the man before him, a reminder that they were no longer in the lawless territories where men like the stranger might have once held sway. $700, the stranger said, not moving, not acknowledging Crow's words except to demonstrate he'd been listening, had heard everything, had measured and weighed it all in some internal calculation. 3 days. Another pause, longer this time, heavy with implications that neither Crow nor Dutch seemed eager to explore. "Heard you suggest the widow had options. What kind of options did you have in mind exactly?" The question hung in the air like a noose, swaying gently in a breeze that had suddenly gone still. Dutch bristled, his young man's pride stung by the stranger's implication, his hand completing its journey to his gun grip. "You best watch your tone, Drifter. Mr. Crow here is a representative of the Western Territories Bank, a legitimate businessman conducting legitimate business. You got no call to suggest otherwise." His voice carried the bluster of youth, that dangerous combination of confidence and inexperience that got men killed in places where words were cheaper than bullets. The stranger's head tilted again, that same curious gesture, and for the first time, Martha saw something that might have been amusement flicker across the visible portion of his face. "Legitimate," he repeated, tasting the word like he might sample spoiled meat. "That's a fine word. Big word. You learned that at banker school?" The mockery was gentle, almost kind, which somehow made it more devastating than any shouted insult could have been. "Here's another fine word for you. Usury. Interest rates that would make a crooked car dealer blush. Loans designed to default. Properties scooped up for pennies on the dollar. How many widows you visit this month, Crow? How many orphans you make homeless in the name of legitimate business?" Crow's face had gone red, a crimson flush creeping up from his collar like rising water. "You have no idea what you're talking about, stranger. The bank operates within the full bounds of territorial law. Every loan is documented. Every foreclosure is legal and proper. If you're suggesting otherwise, you're treading on dangerous ground." His hand moved toward his own weapon, a smaller pistol he kept in a shoulder holster, more for show than utility, the tool of a man who hired others to do his violence. "I'm not suggesting anything," the stranger replied, his voice remaining level, almost conversational. "I'm telling you plain, you're vultures in fancy clothes, and that woman behind me just lost her husband, and you're circling to pick the bones clean before his grave's even settled." He paused, letting that sink in, then added almost as an afterthought, "And you're going to ride away now, and you're not coming back. Ever." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the nervous stamping of the horses and the distant cry of a hawk somewhere overhead. Dutch had gone pale, his youthful bravado draining away as he finally understood that whatever was happening here had moved beyond words, beyond threats, into territory where men's lives could be measured in the space between heartbeats. His hand remained on his gun, but it had become a frozen thing, trapped between pride and survival instinct. Crow, to his credit, held his ground, though Martha could see the calculations running behind his eyes, weighing odds and outcomes, measuring the stranger against the value of one widow's debt. "That's not how this works," he said finally, his voice regaining some of its earlier authority. "The law doesn't bend because some saddle tramp decides to play hero. The debt exists. It's documented and legal. The widow has 3 days to pay, and if she doesn't, the bank will take possession. That's how property rights work in civilized territory." "Then I guess we've got a problem," the stranger said, and for the first time he moved, just a slight shift in his stance, but it changed everything, transformed him from obstacle to threat, from passive to active. Because I'm telling you that's not how it's going to work. Not this time. Not with this widow. His hand, Martha noticed, hadn't moved toward his gun, hadn't needed to. The threat was in his stillness, in the absolute certainty of his words, in the sense that violence was not a possibility, but an inevitability if they chose to pursue this path. Dutch's nerve broke first. "Mr. Crow," he said, his voice tight. "Maybe we should just go. Come back with the sheriff, handle this proper like." His horse was already backing up, responding to the tension in its rider's body, the animal's instinct recognizing danger before the man's pride would allow him to acknowledge it. Crow sat his horse for another long moment, pride warring with pragmatism, the authority of civilization wrestling with the older, darker authority of violence. Finally, he nodded, a sharp, angry gesture. "This isn't over, stranger. You've made a serious mistake interfering with bank business. The law will have something to say about this, I guarantee it." He turned his horse, keeping his eyes on the stranger, unwilling to show his back even in retreat. "Mrs. Henley still owes $700. That debt doesn't disappear because you intimidated a legitimate businessman." "The debt's gone," the stranger said flatly. "Find another widow to rob." Crow opened his mouth, closed it, the calculations running again, faster this time, coming to the same conclusion. He spurred his horse into motion, Dutch falling in beside him, and together they rode away at a pace just short of running, maintaining the fiction of dignity even as they fled. Martha stood on her porch, the broom handle still gripped in her white-knuckled hands, watching the stranger watch the riders disappear into the distance. When they were finally gone, swallowed by heat shimmer and dust, he turned toward her, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. It was younger than she'd expected, though marked by sun and hardship, with the kind of weathered look that came not from years but from experience, from having seen and done things that aged a man from the inside out. His eyes, though, those pale eyes, they looked ancient, looked like they'd witnessed civilizations rise and fall and learned to care about neither. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that Crow's mockery had made obscene, but this man's sincerity restored to courtesy. "Didn't mean to intrude on your business, but I heard what they said, and I couldn't let it stand." His voice, stripped of its earlier menace, was surprisingly gentle, though it still carried that gravelly quality, like he didn't use it often, like words were tools he employed sparingly and with precision. "Who are you?" Martha asked, finding her own voice at last, her heart still hammering in her chest from the confrontation she'd just witnessed. "Why would you risk yourself for a stranger's debt?" The questions tumbled out, born of confusion and desperate hope, and the lingering fear that this was all some fever dream brought on by stress and grief. The stranger shrugged, a loose, easy motion that suggested he'd asked himself the same questions and found the answers either unsatisfying or irrelevant. "Name doesn't matter much. Been called a lot of things in a lot of places, none of them worth repeating. As for why..." He paused, his eyes drifting to the homestead, to the barn, to the children's swing hanging from the oak tree in the yard. "Let's just say I've seen enough widows and orphans get trampled by men who hide behind law and ledgers. Figured it was time somebody stood in the way." "They'll be back," Martha said, the words bitter with certainty. "With the sheriff, like the boy said, or with more men. You can't fight the whole bank, the whole town. They'll make you regret this." She felt tears prickling at her eyes, gratitude and guilt and fear all tangled together into something that made it hard to breathe. "I can't pay you, can't even feed you proper. I've got nothing to offer in exchange for what you just did." The stranger smiled then, a small, sad expression that transformed his face for just a moment, made him look almost human beneath the hard exterior. "Ma'am, I didn't do it for payment, and they might come back. That's true enough. But I'll still be here when they do. That's a promise." He started to turn away, then paused, looking back at her. You got somewhere safe for your children to stay? Just for a few days until this is settled one way or another? Family in town, maybe, or friends who owe you a favor? The town of Redemption Creek had seen its share of trouble over the years, born as it was from the rough marriage of gold fever and cattle drives. But the morning Sheriff Tom Briggs walked into his office to find Silas Crow waiting for him. He knew immediately that whatever was coming would be different. Crow sat in the visitor's chair like it was a throne, his thin frame radiating the coiled energy of a snake preparing to strike, while Dutch lurked near the door with the nervous energy of a man whose pride had been wounded and was eager for the chance to restore it through violence. The sheriff, a heavy-set man in his 50s whose star had long since lost its shine, poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and tried to remember a time when his job had been about keeping the peace rather than keeping the powerful happy. Silas, he said by way of greeting, settling into his own chair behind the scarred wooden desk that had served 3 sheriffs before him. Little early for bank business, isn't it? He sipped his coffee, watching Crow over the rim of his cup, reading the anger in the man's posture, the tight control that suggested something had gone very wrong with whatever scheme the banker had been pursuing. Crow leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. We have a problem, Sheriff. A serious problem that requires immediate law enforcement attention. Yesterday afternoon, Dutch and I were conducting legitimate bank business at the Henley property, collecting on a lawful debt, when we were threatened and intimidated by an armed stranger. He made explicit threats against our lives and interfered with the legal execution of the bank's rights under territorial property law. The sheriff took another slow sip of his coffee, buying time, his mind already working through the implications. The Henley property, the widow whose husband had died a few months back, leaving her with children and debt and no good options. He'd known this was coming, had seen it coming the moment Samuel Henley was laid in the ground. The bank had been patient by its standards, had waited the full quarter before moving to collect, but that patience had never been kindness, just calculation, letting grief soften the widow up before moving in for the kill. A stranger, the sheriff repeated carefully. What kind of stranger? Drunk cowhand looking for trouble? Drifter with more courage than sense? Even as he asked, he knew the answer wouldn't be simple, knew that Crow wouldn't be here, wouldn't be this angry, unless something had genuinely rattled him, and that took more than your average saddle tramp with a cheap pistol and a belly full of rotgut. Dutch spoke up from his position by the door, his young voice eager to establish his version of events. Gunfighter, Sheriff. Professional. The way he stood. The way he moved. The gun he carried. This wasn't some farm boy playing tough. This was a man who's killed before, probably killed often, and he made it clear he was willing to do it again if we didn't clear out. The sheriff felt something cold settle in his stomach. That old instinct from his younger days when he'd actually worn the star with pride, when right and wrong had seemed like fixed points rather than negotiable positions. A professional gunfighter defending a widow's property from debt collectors. It played like something out of a dime novel, except those stories always ended with the hero riding off into the sunset and the widow keeping her farm, while in reality, heroes got buried and widows got evicted, and the bank always won. Did he actually draw on you? The sheriff asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it said, needing to understand exactly how far this had gone. Fire any shots? Make any specific death threats that could be testified to in court? He was looking for the out, for the legal technicality that would let him avoid what Crow was clearly building toward, but he could see from the banker's expression that no such mercy would be forthcoming. He didn't need to draw, Crow said coldly. The threat was implicit in everything about him, in his words, in his posture, in the clear intention to use violence if we didn't comply with his demands. He told us in explicit terms that the widow's debt was void and that we were never to return to her property. That's extortion, Sheriff. That's interfering with lawful commerce. That's a dozen crimes I could name if I bothered to consult my legal references. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight, the sound seeming to echo in the suddenly tense office. "What do you want me to do about it, Silas? Ride out there and arrest him? On what grounds? Your word that he looked threatening? That won't hold up with Judge Morrison, and you know it. The judge has a soft spot for widows, for family farms, for all that frontier sentimentality the bank finds so inconvenient." Crow's smile was thin and entirely without warmth. "I want you to go out there and inform this stranger that his interference is illegal and unwelcome. I want you to make it clear that the bank's rights will be enforced, with or without his cooperation. And if he's foolish enough to resist a lawful order from a peace officer, well, that's his choice to make." The implication was clear, brutal in its simplicity. Force the confrontation. Force the stranger to choose between backing down or facing down the law, and if he chose wrong, if he drew on a sheriff, then his death would be legally justified, morally defensible, and the widow's property would be forfeit regardless. "And if he doesn't resist?" the sheriff asked quietly. "If he just stands there, like he apparently did with you, and tells me the same thing he told you, what then?" He was stalling, he knew, trying to find a path through this that didn't end with him getting killed by a professional gunfighter or becoming the hired muscle for a bank that already owned too much of his soul. Crow stood, smoothing his jacket with precise, angry movements. "Then you remind him that obstruction of justice is a crime, that interfering with lawful business is a crime, and that harboring criminals is a crime if he's helping the widow avoid her legal obligations. You remind him that this town has law, has order, has systems in place to handle disputes, and that men who try to impose their own justice tend to find themselves on the wrong end of a rope." He moved toward the door, pausing to deliver his final point. "The bank has been very generous in its support of this town, Sheriff. Very generous indeed. I'd hate to see that support waver because local law enforcement proved unable or unwilling to protect legitimate business interests." The threat hung in the air after Crow and Dutch had left, as tangible as smoke, as suffocating as a noose. The sheriff sat alone in his office, staring at the star on his chest that had once meant something, that had once represented an ideal he'd been willing to die for, and wondered when exactly it had become just another piece of metal, bought and paid for like everything else in this god-forsaken town. The sun was past noon when Sheriff Briggs finally rode out to the Henley property, moving slowly, in no particular hurry to arrive at a confrontation that might very well be his last. He'd sent word ahead through a boy in town, had made sure the widow knew he was coming official, hadn't wanted to catch anyone by surprise and start shooting before talking had a chance to fail on its own merits. The stranger was waiting for him on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair that had probably belonged to Samuel Henley, looking for all the world like he had every right to be there, like he'd always been there and always would be. "Sheriff," the stranger said, not rising, not showing any particular deference to the star or the man wearing it. "Figured you'd be along sooner or later. Crow strike you as the type to let things go?" His voice carried that same gravelly quality, that same economy of words that suggested he'd learned long ago that most conversations were just preludes to violence and saw little point in prolonging them unnecessarily. Briggs dismounted slowly, his knees protesting the movement, everything protesting these days, his body catching up to his conscience in its decay. "He says you threatened him. Says you interfered with legal bank business. Says you're harboring a debtor and obstructing justice." He recited the charges without conviction, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, like rehearsed lines in a play where everyone knew their roles and everyone hated the script. "I imagine he said a lot of things," the stranger replied, his pale eyes never leaving the sheriff's face, reading him the way a professional gambler reads a mark, seeing all the tells, all the weaknesses, all the calculations running beneath the surface. "Question is, Sheriff, how much of what he said do you actually believe, and how much are you just repeating because the bank owns enough of this town to own you too?" The sheriff felt heat rise in his face, anger and shame fighting for dominance. I'm a peace officer. I enforce the law, not bank policy." Even as he said it, he heard how hollow it sounded, how the words rang false against the reality of his situation. The law says the widow owes a debt. The law says the bank has a right to collect. That's not me talking, stranger. That's territorial statute. The stranger nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "The law," he said, tasting the word the same way he'd tasted legitimate the day before, finding it equally bitter. "Tell me something, Sheriff. Does the law have anything to say about interest rates designed to guarantee default? About banks that prey on desperate men, loan them money they can't possibly repay, then swoop in to collect the collateral for pennies on the dollar? Does the law care about widows and orphans, or just about protecting the property rights of men who've never worked an honest day in their lives?" "That's not my concern," the sheriff said, but his voice lacked force, lacked conviction, because they both knew it was a lie, or should have been his concern, should have been exactly his concern if the star on his chest meant anything at all. "My concern is keeping the peace, and right now, you're disturbing it. Crow wants you gone, wants you to stop interfering with bank business. I'm here to tell you that's going to happen, one way or another." The stranger stood then, rising from the rocking chair with fluid grace, his hand nowhere near his gun, but the threat implicit in every movement, every shift of weight. "One way or another," he repeated. "That sounds like you're giving me a choice, Sheriff. So let me make it easy for you. I'm not leaving. The widow's debt is void. Crow can come back with 10 men or 50, can bring you or bring the territorial marshal, and my answer will be the same. Nobody's taking this woman's home, not while I'm breathing." The sheriff's hand drifted toward his own weapon, not with intent, but with instinct, the old reflexes of a younger man who might have answered such defiance with force. But his fingers stopped before reaching the grip, stopped because he saw something in the stranger's eyes, that cold certainty that said drawing would be the last mistake Tom Briggs ever made. "You're going to get yourself killed," he said quietly, "and probably me with you, and at the end of it all, the bank will still own this property, and the widow will still be on the street." "Maybe," the stranger conceded. "Or maybe some things are worth dying for. Maybe some stands need to be taken even when the odds are bad, even when the ending's already written." He smiled that small, sad smile again. "You were a good lawman once, I think. I can see it in you, buried under all the compromise and corruption. Somewhere in there is a man who pinned on that star because he believed it meant something." The sheriff stood there, caught between what he was and what he'd been, between the man who took the bank's money and the man who'd once believed in justice. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and regret. Finally, Tom Briggs did something he hadn't done in years. He made a choice. "I'll tell Crow I gave you the warning," he said slowly, carefully, knowing that every word was a step off a cliff with no way back. "I'll tell him you refused to comply, that you made clear your intention to resist. And then I'll tell him that if he wants you removed, he'll need to find someone else to do it, someone who's willing to kill a man for protecting a widow." He turned toward his horse, then paused, looking back. 3 days from now, when that debt comes due, I won't be there to help Crow collect. Won't help you either, understand? But I won't stand in your way." The stranger nodded, understanding passing between them, that recognition that sometimes neutrality was the closest thing to honor a man could manage. "Fair enough, Sheriff. That's all I'm asking." As Briggs rode away, he heard the stranger call after him. "There's still time to be the man you used to be. Just thought you should know." 3 days later, when Silas Crow returned to the Henley property with 4 hired guns and a legal writ of possession, he found the stranger waiting, standing in the middle of the yard with his hand loose at his side and death in his eyes. The confrontation that followed lasted less than a minute. When it was over, Crow was the only one still breathing besides the stranger, and he rode back to town to wire the bank that the Henley loan should be marked as paid in full, and the property deed transferred to Martha Henley free and clear. Some debts, he'd learned, were too expensive to collect. The stranger stayed long enough to help rebuild the fence line and repair the barn roof, then disappeared one morning before dawn, leaving behind only a note weighted down by a stone on the porch. Martha found it when she came out to watch the sunrise, the paper bearing just 3 words in a careful, practiced hand: "Debt is paid."